A year in review. A look at some of this year's top stories, including the clergy abuse crisis rocking the church, from the Pennsylvania grand jury report to an exclusive interview with a Cardinal Theodore McCarrick abuse survivor who broke his silence after decades. Plus, one-on-one with the Vice President. My conversation from earlier in the year with Mike Pence on the Trump administration's commitment to religious freedom. And celebrations at the Vatican. 70,000 people attend the Mass for 7 new saints. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, December 31st, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Tonight, a year in review of some of the top stories we covered here on News Nightly. We begin with the clergy sex abuse crisis. Earlier this year, it erupted in the U.S., Chile, and elsewhere. Pope Francis has invited church leaders to a meeting in February to respond to what has become the gravest threat to his pontificate. Pope Francis is still working on recovering from his handling of the abuse scandal in Chile earlier this year, when he repeatedly discredited victims of a Chilean predator priest. That was followed by accusations by retired Vatican ambassador Carlo Vigano that Pope Francis himself rehabilitated Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. McCarrick is accused of molesting and harassing adult seminarians. The Pope has yet to respond to these allegations, although he has ordered a limited investigation and ordered McCarrick to live a lifetime of penance and prayer. We also saw the acceptance of the resignation of Cardinal Donald Wuerl of Washington. He continues to serve as apostolic administrator in the Archdiocese until a replacement is named. Calls grew for Wuerl's removal after the release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report. That report was released in August. It identified more than 300 priests who molested children in 6 dioceses in the last 70 years. It also accused church leaders of covering up the abuse. The report is a result of an 18-month investigation led by Pennsylvania's Attorney General Josh Shapiro. We sent correspondent Jason Calvi to Harrisburg.
Good evening, Lauren. The report is nearly 900 pages long. It identifies some 1,000 child abuse victims, including boys and girls. The grand jury began its review back in 2016. They looked at some 500,000 internal church documents.
I'm here, finally, to announce the results of a 2-year grand jury investigation into widespread sexual abuse of children within the Catholic Church and the systematic cover-up by senior church officials in Pennsylvania and at the Vatican.
Today, Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro is demanding justice for these victims.
Who would have believed me? A priest in 1948 or 47 would abuse you?
This is not a vendetta against the church.
I just feel like my whole life has been a lie.
Court records in a largely secret, months-long legal fight over the grand jury's report say that it identifies 301 predator priests. The abuse allegedly took place in these 6 dioceses: Allentown, Erie, Greensburg, Harrisburg, Scranton, and Pittsburgh. The report claims some bishops brushed aside victims and protected abusers.
Some of the dioceses sought to prevent the entire report from ever seeing the light of day. In effect, they wanted to cover up the cover-up. They sought to do the same thing that senior church leaders in the dioceses we investigated have done for decades.
Washington's Cardinal Donald Wuerl was Bishop of Pittsburgh from 1998 to 2006. He's defending himself, saying, "I believe the report confirms that I acted with diligence, with concern for the victims, and to prevent future acts of abuse." Attorney General Shapiro says he's not backing down.
The time for institutions to place their own interests above protecting our children is over.
Cardinal Wuerl is mentioned in this report some 200 times. The report in total is 900 pages long, so there's still a lot to digest. But our colleagues at Catholic News Agency have found that of the 19 cases against priests that arose during Cardinal Wuerl's time as Bishop of Pittsburgh, they said 18 of those priests were removed from ministry immediately. Lauren?
So what happens to those priests who are still active in ministry?
So several priests are fighting claims against them. So what was released today was a redacted copy of the grand jury's report. The Supreme Court of Pennsylvania will have oral arguments in their claims in September. Now, the Diocese of Pittsburgh, the current bishop there, says there are just a few priests that are still serving actively in ministry. He says the diocese did investigate the allegations against those priests, and they found those claims unsubstantiated.
We must forgive the bishops. It's probably the last thing you would expect to hear from a survivor. But that is exactly what the man who claims Archbishop Theodore McCarrick abused him for nearly 2 decades says. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby spoke one-on-one with James Grine in his first interview since using his full name publicly. He says the disgraced Archbishop shattered his trust. But he also says it didn't destroy his faith.
I didn't see him every day, but every day I saw him, he abused me.
60-year-old James Grine says it's difficult to relive the painful memories of abuse. After decades of silence, he's opening up about Theodore McCarrick, the former Archbishop of Washington, who he says molested him for 18 years.
He's a sad, weak man who has lost his faith in Jesus Christ.
James was born in New Jersey to a big Catholic family. He tells me McCarrick was a longtime family friend, a man he called his Uncle Teddy.
He was part of the very fabric of my family. And so when he came to visit us, whether it was in New Jersey or in California, it was important that he was there because the priest is here. The holy man is here, and we all have awe towards him.
James says his father told him to do whatever Uncle Teddy said, that he could trust then Father McCarrick. And so James says as a child, he opened himself up completely.
I was able to sit across from him and talk to him and show him my body language and really get to the depth of what was going on because I trusted him more than I've ever trusted anybody.
That trust was shattered in 1969 when he was 11 years old. That's when James says the abuse started. It happened at his family home in New Jersey when the two were alone. He was afraid to tell anyone, even his own brothers and sisters.
What did you say to yourself in those times when you were alone?
That I must hide what is happening to me. I cannot tell anybody, and I have to protect myself from anybody else, because if this man's doing it to me, how many others are going to do this to me if I open my mouth? And I cut myself off from God, from other human beings, and got lost.
James stopped going to church as a teen and began drinking and eventually using drugs. For the next 2 decades, it got worse. When he was 33 years old, he tried to commit suicide by overdosing on gin and prescription painkillers.
I went to an emergency room. They said to me that they had somebody for me to talk to. I was afraid, but I did. The person on the other end of the phone said, 10 years ago, I did the exact same thing you did tonight. And today, I live happy, joyous, and free. That was God. Been a lot of God moments.
It was then, in 1991, that James stopped drinking and doing drugs and started praying again. He stopped speaking to McCarrick and began a path to recovery. James hopes to lend his voice to other victims of abuse and addiction and let them know they're not alone. As for the now disgraced Archbishop,
I pray for him every day so that he may feel the need to repent, to just tell the truth.
If you are the victim of clergy sex abuse, contact the National Abuse Hotline at 800-656-HOPE. Meanwhile, I traveled to Rome in September as the Vatican responded to accusations top officials, including the Holy Father, covered up the sexual misconduct of Theodore McCarrick. Here's my conversation from Rome with Wyatt Goolsbee. Wyatt, sources within the Vatican tell me that top officials are struggling with the response to this burgeoning scandal, but they have begun to recognize the enormity of the problem and understand that what has been done and said so far is doing little to quell the criticism. They have been having an internal debate about how to engage the issue without compounding the problem. And in that vein, Pope Francis's top advisors said here today that the Vatican is preparing the necessary clarifications about the charges, which originated with former nuncio Carlo Vigano. Members of the church hierarchy covered up for disgraced former cardinal in Washington, Theodore McCarrick. At the same time, the 9 cardinals at today's meeting expressed full solidarity with the Pope in this unprecedented crisis. The key, of course, is going to be the nature of these clarifications and how they are willing to do this in response to the scandal. Also at issue, what to do about the current Washington Archbishop, Cardinal Donald Wuerl, who is under pressure to resign after a Pennsylvania grand jury report accused him of failing to act against numerous priests accused of sexual abuse and reassigning some to other parishes. The Pope met with Wuerl last week and told him to discern his response with his fellow priests. We have learned that the president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, will be meeting with the Pope here in Rome on Thursday.
Lauren, does this talk of clarification suggest the Vatican realizes that silence is not the way to approach this crisis?
Yes. The Pope, as you'll recall, originally said he would not say one word about the charges in the Vigano letter, but said he may speak later, and then called on journalists to do their job to discern the truth. His Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, told an Italian news agency last week that he was taking the same tack. But as reverberations throughout the media and the church itself are growing stronger, it seems the Pope's advisors are taking note. It's rare that they release a statement after the first of 3 days of meetings. We don't normally have a daily press release, but this time they thought it was necessary. Now, some bishops and priests have also been speaking out about the Vatican's limited responses, and sources here tell me that pushing back on the allegations is not so simple, because the Vatican has needed to pore over documents within its archives to determine exactly what actually happened and to decide with prudence how it should be addressed. There's a strong feeling here that Americans often demand quick answers by the next news cycle, but that it is sometimes impossible based on the complexity of the allegations. Wyatt.
Lauren Ashburn reporting from Rome tonight. Thanks, Lauren.
Coming up, my interview from earlier this year with the Vice President of the United States. And a look back at tough questions for President Trump by our White House correspondent, Mark Irons. Welcome back to this special Year in Review edition of EWTN News Nightly. I'm Lauren Ashburn. In May, President Trump celebrated the National Day of Prayer by signing an executive order launching an initiative recognizing the vital role of religion in our country.
We take this step because we know that in solving the many, many problems and our great challenges, faith is more powerful than government, and nothing is more powerful than God.
The order ensures faith-based groups will have a voice in government. Among those in attendance at a ceremony in the Rose Garden, Vice President Mike Pence and faith leaders including a rabbi, a Buddhist, and outgoing D.C. Cardinal Donald Wuerl. That same day, I spoke one-on-one with Vice President Pence. He told me about the development of new policies and laws that reflect freedom of religion. Mr. Vice President, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Lauren. Great to have you here on the National Day of Prayer.
It is great to be here. Part of the initiative that the president signed into executive order today said that it wants to reduce burdens of the exercise of free religion. Doesn't our Constitution already protect freedom of religion?
It absolutely does. In the very First Amendment of the Constitution, it protects the free exercise thereof. But as you know, Lauren, for many years, government policies and regulations have infringed on the free exercise of religion in the advancement of other policies. We think of the Little Sisters of the Poor, the action the President took last year to make sure that this administration would end any effort to restrict the freedom of religion or conscience of any organization in the country. But this year what the President did was really take that process of developing policy and bring it right into the center of the White House.
The President has been very vocal about U.S. religious freedom. When talking about the freedom of religion for those around the world, where does that rank in the priorities for the White House?
It's an enormously high priority. You need look no further than the Oval Office this last Monday when the President welcomed the President of Nigeria, and they're called out to the President our desire to work closely with them to end the burning of churches and the murder of Christians that's taken place at the hands of terrorists in that country. The President took decisive action following on great work that you did on this network to make sure that now over $100 million in U.S. aid is going directly to religious-based Christian organizations in the Nineveh Plain. We're helping now to rebuild Christian communities and religious minorities in ways that just wasn't happening under the UN program. But I can tell you during my travels through the Middle East, my travels across the world, that America's commitment to religious freedom, to standing with people of faith that are facing persecution, whatever their faith background, is at the center of our policy.
Let's switch to abortion. This administration says and describes itself as one of the foremost defenders of the sanctity of life in the history of the White House. The President did sign the omnibus bill that funds Planned Parenthood, continues to fund it. The campaign promised to defund Planned Parenthood. Where are we on that? What can we say to those who are pro-life, who are looking to this administration to defund Planned Parenthood?
Well, Lauren, as you know, I'm pro-life and I don't apologize for it. And I just couldn't be more proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with the most pro-life president in my lifetime. This is a president who reaffirmed the Mexico City policy, restricting the use of U.S. tax dollars in foreign aid to support abortion overseas. He actually expanded that policy. He's been appointing conservatives to the courts from the highest court on down all across this land. He's taken decisive steps to affirm our commitment to the sanctity of life. And all I can tell you is that we're continuing to look at policies and practices to make sure that not only are we protecting the unborn, but that we're protecting taxpayers who cherish the sanctity of life. And we'll continue to work earnestly on those issues in the days ahead.
On immigration, the Catholic bishops have spoken up vociferously about the rights of those who are trying to come to the United States, who are being persecuted in their countries. The numbers of refugees coming in are the lowest that we have seen them in recent years. How do you balance the right of countries to protect their borders and to help those less fortunate?
I think the balance all begins with the rule of law, Lauren. The President has said a nation without borders is not a nation. And we're absolutely determined to build a wall, to reform our border security, to give our Border Patrol agents the resources that they need, and reform our immigration laws that too often serve as a magnet for vulnerable people to be exploited by drug cartels or human traffickers who will give them the hope of coming either legally or illegal into this country, and vulnerable families then travel thousands of miles at great risk to do that. We really believe that by reaffirming our commitment to border security, by reforming our laws to end that magnet that seems to entice vulnerable populations, then we'll be able to do what the American people have done throughout our history and do to this day, and that is that open our arms to people that are seeking asylum, open our arms to refugees, but to do it under the law. That's the President's commitment, and we believe it's what the American people want to see.
Before we go, a comedian on Saturday mocked your belief that abortion is murder. How do you feel about that?
Well, I stand without apology for the sanctity of life, and have worked throughout my career to advance that principle in the public square. But anytime I'm criticized, for standing for what we believe. I count it all joy, as the good book says.
Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lauren. Good to be with you.
November saw the first midterm elections for President Donald Trump, and with the threat of Republicans losing control of Congress, our team of reporters traveled around the country, talking to voters and highlighting key issues for Catholics. During the lead-up to election night, Jason Calvi traveled to Missouri and Arizona. Wyatt Goolsbee traveled to his home state of Texas to report on the tight Senate race, and Mark Irons followed the president to Indiana for a Make America Great Again rally. Speaking of Mark, he has been hard at work all year questioning President Trump at the White House about a wide range of topics, from immigration to abortion. Let's take a look.
Thank you, Mr. President. You have campaigned as a pro-life president. You have defended the rights of unborn children. You now have a divided Congress. It's unlikely to pass any pro-life bills.
Very tough issue.
How are you going to push forward your pro-life agenda?
Just going to push. I've been pushing. I've done a very good job, too. We're very happy with me, but it's a tough issue for the two sides. There's no question about it.
But what are you going to do?
There is great division. What am I going to do? I won't be able to explain that to you, because it is an issue that is a very divisive, polarizing issue. But there is a solution. I think I have that solution, and nobody else does. We're going to be working on that.
If you cut aid to Central America, won't that cause more migrants to...
I can't tell you. I can only tell you this. We give them hundreds of millions of dollars. They do nothing for us.
How will cutting aid keep migrants from coming up to the country?
Maybe it will, and maybe it won't.
Before he left the White House, I asked the president if he plans to meet again soon with Kim Jong-un.
Will you meet with Kim, Mr. President?
A moment earlier, I asked the president about the administration's decision to limit the number of refugees allowed into the U.S.
Why are you cutting the refugee camp to 30,000? Because we want to be able to take what we can handle.
Up next, we were in Rome this fall as Pope Francis canonized new saints. Welcome back. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Finally tonight, a look at the newest saints in the Catholic Church. In October, Pope Francis canonized 7, including 2 towering Catholic figures. Vatican correspondent Juliette Lindley has a recap.
In front of 70,000 faithful in St. Peter's Square, Pope Francis declared Pope Paul VI and Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador saints, along with 2 priests, 2 nuns, and a 19-year-old Italian. Francis wore the blood-stained rope belt Romero was wearing when he was gunned down in 1980, and he used Pope Paul VI's staff, chalice, and pallium vestment. Paul, who was Pope from 1963 to 78, presided over the Second Vatican Council. The landmark summit modernized the Church and implemented reforms. He's also known for his encyclical Humanae Vitae, which rejected artificial birth control. Relics of the 7 saints were on display, and tapestries adorned the facade of St. Peter's Basilica. One of the 7 is Maria Katharina Kasper of Germany.
That humility, that putting herself aside and always trying to do what God wanted her to do, that's what she models to us.
Some 5,000 Salvadoran pilgrims traveled to Rome to witness Mass, and tens of thousands more stayed up late to watch the celebration outside the San Salvador Cathedral, where Romero's remains are entombed. Romero's influence continues to resonate with El Salvador's youth as the country endures brutal gang violence. Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly.
That does it for this special edition of EWTN News Nightly. Thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. We hope you have a blessed evening, and we'll see you next year. Good night, and God bless you.